Hello, thanks for being here. My name is Dorsa. I am an architect by education, and I'm currently a PhD student studying the relations between video games and architecture. I usually analyze and write about games for architects interested in interactive spaces, making interactive spaces virtual spaces. So I'm really honored and intrigued to be here and having this talk for people in game industry to talk about how to use architecture to tell stories. For my own research project, I had some interviews with game designers in which they shared that their inspiration for creating imaginative worlds in games often comes from their surroundings and memories of places that they have been. When it comes to level design, they measure doors, windows, dimensions of different spaces that they live in. So they use real-world references. When I was thinking about what aspects of architecture design could be interesting for game designers, I decided to show examples from those architectural projects and theories that can be a source of inspiration for you in your design process to conceptualize spaces that do not yet exist. And those ones that have some kind of narrative to them, albeit architectural narrative, which is a bit different from narrative in storytelling media. And it needs a bit of clarification. Narrative in video games is a very omnipresent notion. So video games are basically known as storytelling media. And many video games are centered around dramatic structures of storytelling to provide unique experiences for players. There are some range of traditional techniques to tell stories in games. Some of these methods are more immersive than the other, like dialogues and conversations between characters are more immersive ways that emerge from the world versus dialogue boxes or literal narrators to advance the plot, which are forced ways of storytelling that are scripted and you cannot pass them. Finding notes emerge from the world but are opt-in and supplementary elements, and the player might miss them and not engage with some parts of the story. And then there is environmental storytelling and a specific aspect of that we can call, as part of this talk, architectural acts in games that are crucial aspects in connecting the player to the game world. The environment is the part that the player can directly and unconsciously engage with as part of their gameplay. And through the design of the world, designers can affect the player's perception and their understanding of that world to then act upon them. And of course, game designers consider their players as smart people who appreciate the subtlety to the narrative that they are encountered in the world. So game designers use architecture and architectural elements as tools to strengthen the visual stories in games, either by simulating architecture from reality and adding elements of fantasy, like in many realistic games, or inspiring from architectural structures to use them in game mechanics and game rules. So architecture is a tool to help story arc experiences, and it can be used either in the background to make engaging environmental storytelling or as game mechanics so players make their own stories. Narrative in architecture, rather than being storytelling as its traditional sense, does not mean buildings telling stories, but it refers to how architecture as the built environment in general provides experience, how it makes you feel, how architecture conveys an understanding of that space you're in or surrounded at that moment. Putting it plainly, narrative in architecture is how the built environment can shape human experiences. And I will go through this topic by introducing some examples. My aim is to show how architects and urban designers think and design spaces that shape our real-world experiences. And the examples try to work as sources of inspiration for you to help you tell your own interactive stories in creating experiential spaces. Some aspects that you can think about when encountering these examples or after this session about architecture are: what kind of experience and atmosphere does this building evoke? What is the story behind the designer's choices? What are the circumstances of those choices? Is it referring to a function? Is it holding anything? How using narrative structures in environmental design can be a tool for designing fantastical worlds that do not yet exist. I'm going to touch on the topic by providing examples in 3 scales: city scale, individual buildings, and then architectural elements. So I start with the first one. At the scale of the city, urban designers emphasize how much the city is legible and readable for their inhabitants and visitors. For sure, when you go to a city, some parts of the city, there are some parts that you like, some parts you hate, and some parts that are memorable for you. You make distinct memories of different cities that you go to, of the personality of the city, and you make an image of that city in your mind. And if you ask me about references, there are more examples I'm going through, but these are some references that are interesting for you to have a look. Kevin Lynch, his book, The Image of the City, and Gordon Cullen, The Concise Townscape. So in the first book, The Image of the City, Kevin Lynch, the writer and an urbanist, did interviews with people living in particular cities and found out that there are some urban elements that help people to describe their surroundings, how they understand a city, or what is known as making a memory trace or cognitive image of a city. What enables them to better navigate the urban areas and not to be lost. He noted 5 elements that have storytelling potentials in a city: paths like rail lines, trail lines, streets; edges as clear transition zones and linear boundaries or waterfronts; districts as quarters and neighborhoods; nodes meaning strategic meeting points like squares, junctions, train stations; and landmarks like points of interest, reference points. These elements make a city memorable for people, help them to find their way in a city. So there are some storytelling potentials to evoke particular senses and how they are remembered. In games like Elden Ring or Assassin's Creed, designers use landmarks or points of interest to help the players understand where they are, enable them to move. And in Elden Ring, it is always reminding you the goal. In open world games especially, as you go through paths and backtrack, these elements help to make that cognitive image of the world, which helps to minimize focusing the attention to minimaps. And this is the goal of designers, to see the environment that you design rather than players focusing on the map. The second book by Gordon Cullen, titled The Concise Townscape, takes a similar approach, looking for structures that make a city dramatic and help to make meaningful memories. But the approach is to look at certain paths from A to B, seeking for how vistas are changing in a more linear and cinematic way to make thrilling narratives while moving along paths, going from one point to the other. In the drawing on the screen, he's showing a certain path to study how it changes along this way, noting things like trees, arches, changing the width of the passage, dead ends, making you shifting, turning. So unfolding vistas, contrasts, and sudden changes, surprises. There is a theatrical approach and cinematic sequence, like storyboards for their visual experience. Games often use the same linearity and sequences to narrate the environment. This is the gameplay from the beginning of The Last of Us, which shows how the environment is directed to change, how it blocks the way. If not considering the people that you are following, the environment design directs players to head to the next space. Oh, sorry. So it is designed in a very linear way, which gives more control to not miss the stories embedded in the surroundings. So it is a different approach from the other way. This is an example from a group called the Situationist International, which were active during 1957 to 1972. This group was combined by artists and writers. They tried to introduce a new way of looking at a city and reimagining the city that they lived in through their works, which was an artistic and also a political movement. For this new understanding, they used two techniques. One was called derive, which means drift, and refers to wandering in Paris and roaming the city for spontaneous and continuous experiences, wandering and finding places that they would be drawn to, either being captivating or even repelling, unattractive, unpleasant, letting the city itself to speak and direct them. And the second technique was determent, which is the act of cutting and collaging these spaces that attracted them in a new way. So as you can see in this iconic image, they were picking existent spaces in Paris, and then they put them together in new ways. The picture on the right shows the real locations of these spaces, and on the left, their new understanding, so changing the original. A collage with new relations, making a fictional version of the city that you live in. Stray somehow started with this approach to the city. The game was not ignited by the narrative of the cat, but purely by inspiring from Kowloon Walled City in Hong Kong and recreating it. The designers were attracted to these spatial and architectural parts, and the first image of their concept for the game was the image from the laneway that they shared in the social media. This approach of reimagining cities can be seen in historical artistic mappings too. This is a map of Rome by Giovanni Pranesi. It shows Rome, but with one main difference, that is, it is consisted of landmarks, of memorable bits of Rome that we see them. We will, when you see it, you will be like, yes, it is Rome. So it is recreated the city by their points of interest and landmarks. And this is how recreating a city happens in games, for the simulation of a real city to give you the vibe of that. You will not need to make all the details, all the existing details to resemble it. And this is an analysis of GTA 5 by Luke Pearson, who is a multidisciplinary academic between video games and architecture. And the map is a comparison between the fictional city of Los Santos compared to real LA. And we see that Los Santos is very smaller than Los Angeles, because as to experience a city, you do not need to make everything. You can create points of interest and some routes that connect them together. So the player is experiencing the city according to points of interest, how they are connected, vistas, and how the sequences of spaces are designed. And the same thing happens in Assassin's Creed to introduce real-world cities in the game. And now we get to the second section of these categories to talk about design in the scale of individual buildings. how to make one building maybe memorable, how buildings can stand in contrast to their surroundings and to speak their character in different way. In this section, I try to make examples from those architectural buildings that are not just offering a background for activities, but when these buildings also become an object to be seen. So talking about how architecture can show themselves and can speak out their characteristics. And these are some references that you can look at after this session. So I will go through more examples, but these are interesting architects with interesting design. So Rem Koolhaas is someone who both read narrative in existing buildings, and you can have a look at this book, Delirious New York, but also loaded narrative for his own projects in this book, SMLXL, which is a very big book. And incidentally, he was a script writer before becoming an architect. So in his works, he approached narrative. Aldo Rossi is considered one of the most influential architects and theorists of the 20th century, particularly known for his theory, urban design, and his distinctive approach to make memory through architecture. And this book, The Architecture of the City, is his famous book. And works of Louis Kahn are excellent in the use of materiality, form, natural elements like light and rhythm. As I said, there is a lot to say about buildings in different ways, but what I think can be interesting in video games and in level design is when buildings can draw attention to. Using architectural language and tools that architects have, like geometry, dimensions, proportions, materials. So using this language, sometimes architects try to design buildings that are not static. And these ideas of movement, changes, transformations draws the eye. And they can either make architectural components movable and changeable or introduce changes when people move through spaces. And I'm going to talk about these two different approaches. One, making a whole component of a building movable, and second one, raising feelings while people move in a space. In video games, the idea of change and transformation in the environment can hint to an event, like changing the color of the cloud ring of the Death Mountain in Ocarina of Time. There is no subtlety in this transformation. The once peaceful smoke ring, now being a ring of fire, tells everyone universally something bad has happened here. And my goal is to show how architects introduce the concept of movability in a static building. So they might be employable in level design for you to signal an event. Or Control uses this notion of transformation in cleansing scenes with formal and architectural shifts. Architectural and formal changes can take symbiotic roles in games. Teatro del Mundo, did I miss one? Oh, sorry. Teatro del Mundo was a pavilion building for an exhibition called the Biennale in Venice, which is still a very important exhibition, architectural exhibition that happens every 2 years in Venice. This was a temporary building that had to be dismantled after the exhibition. There are some fun aspects about this building. The design of it, at best, is simple, with simple geometry and basic colors that stand in a stark contrast to its surrounding, which is Venice, with Gothic architecture, as we know. And at worst, you might call it ugly, boring, or even childish. But as I mentioned, the architect of the building, Aldo Rossi, had a specific way to introduce the idea of memory, and here he's making a performative object. The interesting part of it is its mobility on the lagoon in Venice, and to visit the building and to appreciate it, you had to first find it. So this building, for some period of time during the exhibition, temporarily changed the landscape of the city. Its function was a theater, and it was designed as a place to see a theater inside and to be seen from outside, to work not just as an exhibition, but a billboard floating on waters. Sometimes architects want to change the interior spaces to fit different events within, and their design, and this design that you can see, to transform something inside of it affects the other parts of the building rather than just rearranging the interior. Product Transformer is a temporary structure that accommodates 4 different cultural programs, which include an art exhibition, a cinema, a fashion exhibition, and a special event for Prada shows. The idea is to transform one unique space for 4 functions. The basic geometrical shape on each side, which are a circle, a rectangle, a cross, and a hexagon, are designed to fit the function at best to work for the plan. And after each event, they use cranes to rotate it. The architect described the design as walls becoming floors and floors becoming walls through this rotation and flip to accommodate different events. The location of this structure was next to a 16th century palace in the center of Seoul, and the structure stands with stark contrast to it, very ancient and very modern, Western and Asian. The contrast between the structure and its surrounding is also clear through the use of material, a white translucent membrane that wraps the structure and links different shapes of the structure together. The extreme mode of these variants can be found in this project in Kiev, Ukraine. When it is closed, it is not clear what the building is. The idea for this structure conceptualized the synagogue as a closed book that when the congregation gather together to read the book, it opens to share a world of historical anecdotes, morals, and wisdom. This is a cool idea, something opening up to reveal what has been hidden, but it has practical limitations. Taking away those limitations in a medium such as film or even video games gets you an even cooler effect, like this. I couldn't think of any examples in video games, so this was the first thing that came to my mind. Usually in games, to draw attention, designers use light or camera work, or making things bigger, or overlaying a button press. I believe you can also think of architecture in this way to more organically do these highlights. The second way that I want to talk about as a way to enhance the architectural experience is very similar to what I mentioned in the part talking about cities. While people are moving, and through this movement you realize the change of space, again like a storyboard, but in buildings and their associated characteristics, forms, dimensions, proportions, materials. Here, how to flow the movement in a space becomes a part of the design, allowing architecture to tell a story through the journey it creates. And this is a very common way of storytelling in games, how to design the movement and sequences on the way. The Jewish Museum in Berlin is a powerful example of how architecture can narrate a dramatic history in this way. Their building tells the story of the Jewish people's history using form, scale, lighting, and materials to evoke emotional responses. It will take people through long and broken paths, which emphasize the idea of the historical journey of the Jewish people, displacement, persecution. The zigzag paths symbolize the fragmentary and the broken lines repeat on the facade of the building. Inside of the building, along the way, the scale of corridors change and get wider or narrower to convey a sense of claustrophobia and discomfort or hardship. In one part of the museum, you are not walking on a nice smooth surface. You actually have to walk on creepy, big, heavy metal faces that will make disturbing sounds that echo in this confined space with a very high ceiling. Referring to the Jewish history, they are using environmental storytelling in architectural terms here. Each architectural element plays a role in telling the story, creating a visceral connection between the space and the history it represents through playing with forms and a scale of spaces. One of my friends also let me know that the sound is somehow industrial on this loose sculpture and refers to the industrial way of masculine. Water Temple creates this sequence of spatial experiences with a downward movement to the temple beneath a lotus pond. The architecture tries to make a profound connection to nature and guide the movement of visitors around the building, blocks their view to the pond with an unadorned concrete wall, and then down to the hall, which is dark, and you have to move towards the light. So through form, he's making a spiritual journey. Spaces in in-house are also designed by considering how to change spaces while you're moving from a public outdoor space to inside. It introduces 3 kinds of spaces: open, semi-open, and closed along the way. The open public space transforms to closed private spaces inside while you move inward, and vice versa when you move outward. For this, the scale and the height change, and this idea of seeing spaces as volumes can be interesting for games. So what I mean by that, to consider spaces as volumes, is that if this would be the plan, a map design for a game, it gives a feeling like you have the spaces and functions and programs are arranged under one roof. And then these spaces just need to be extruded to accommodate the function. But we can play with volumes to make interesting spaces, both inside and outside, how to change proportions and dimensions in them. Also here, changing the topography of the plan, going up and down, introduces new places of events and also helps to create different lines of sight. In control, we can see this continuity and changes in design of architecture. The character Jesse finds the power of flying temporarily within the space. Here, the architectural design of spaces should adapt to this new ability. She is not always using the stairs to navigate. Using this new ability requires a space that let this happen in the best way. In this scene, architecture should adapt to the new action to show this idea of verticality, where it is defining another way of interactivity and also another viewpoint to the game space. The consideration of actions and according to that designing of spaces can be compared to Metroidvania games in 2D spaces where the level design is specifically designed for the actions, and later when you find more abilities in the game, spaces change to respond to other added abilities. Control does the same in 3D space, where architecture can play a main role to provide this dramatic experience through organizing spaces. So atrium in Control performs as an elevator, as a circulatory connection, redefining its meaning in games. This building also thinks of spaces as volumetric, that can vary. It is designed more inherently with the idea of three-dimensionality of spaces. This is a residential place, which is changing the definition of plan to not situate everything on one level and creating discrete platforms. It arranges rooms as chunks of spaces next to each other and connect them using stairs from different directions. That will create a specific way of navigation and creates different ways of different sides of line to each chunks of space. Remkulaus in this project tries to really take this idea of continuity and movement and emphasize it even more. Koolhaas is using ramps, which are smoother modes of navigation to move people from one floor to the other, to connect spaces, which is a lot more continuous. This one has more flow as opposed to the previous example, which was more distinct. It is used to exceptionally good effect in Silent Hill PT. It is an infinitely repeating corridor that you continuously pass through. With each cycle, the corridor changes, becoming noticeably unsettling and more evil, with subtleties like a monstrous entity spying on you through a cracked door and bleeding walls. In the design of the corridor, what is happening is using the idea of continuity, as you can see in the diagram. So this is the last part I want to talk about, which is about elements and details. In visualization, it is important to reach to a coherent aesthetic. To achieve this, designers should pay attention to both the overall design and also the world-building elements, such as what assets and materials to use, details to make sure the authenticity of the world building. So rather than using free assets, trying to design them for that environment to form a unified visual language. On this matter, there is a lot to learn and be inspired from real-world designs, like the transition between different materials, how different forms work together, how lighting design works. In architecture, elements can be seen in two ways. One is separate small-scale components like doors, corridors, and hallways that are spaces by themselves and make the whole building, or details like light, materials, structures that are tectonic aspects of architecture that can add atmospheric details to a space to make a different sensation in that. And I'm going to talk briefly about these two categories, that how they can contribute to storytelling in video games. So first, spatial components. These are really good books by Remkulaus to have a look, which goes deep in some detailed information and history of each component. So each space has a function, each component. Walls for separation of spaces, ramps, stairs, elevators for connecting levels, corridors for connecting rooms in the same level. Storytelling media like video games and like cinema can change the meaning and definition of these spaces in reality. So hallways, as they are holding their meaning as connecting rooms, they can be spaces of events. The story element of the video game can make these spaces be incredibly evocative. Architects try to combine components too in their design and to give them new definitions. In this example, which is a building designed for a disabled person who could not walk after an accident, in the design of the house, the elevator became the most important feature for him and so for the house. The architect combined elevator and library together and designed it in the very heart of the main space. There is also a movie made from this house that features the navigation of the maid cleaning the house, which is really interesting. Or Lina Bobardi combines theater and the idea of street. So she sees people, audience, as more active in a space, so it will affect the design of the space, how to arrange them and how to where to place the stage. The second way to look at elements and details in architecture is to look at their tectonics. Tectonics in architecture refer to making and construction and the activity that raises this construction to an art form. So architects play with these textures, lights, materiality, how they show the structure all the time for their advantage in their design, so they can elevate that to an art form.
To express is to drive, and when you want to give something presence, you have to consult nature, and there is where design comes in. If you think of brick, for instance, you say to brick, "What do you want, brick?" And brick says to you, "I like an arch." And if you say to brick, "Look, arches are expensive, and I can use a concrete lintel over you," what do you think of that, brick? Brick says, "I like an arch." And it's important, you see, that you honor the material which you use. You don't bandy it around as though you said, "Well, we have a lot of material around. We can do it one way, we can do it another." It's not true. You can only do it if you honor the brick and glorify the brick instead of just shortchanging it.
This is a very famous quote by the American architect Louis Kahn, that even the brick wants to be something. It highlights that there are some properties of materials that can affect the design. Their relevant arrangements, textures, colors, joints, their impact on the structure, and how parts are assembled together. This building that he designed shows the relations of using properties of the material structure, paying attention to details and the feelings they convey. From the outside, it shows a heavy buildup of structures, but looking closely at the bottom, the structure holes are wider. And on the top, the pillars that are part of the facade get thinner, and windows get larger. Also, in the four corners, when you expect to see columns, they are sliced off. So it is not the main structure. The main structure that holds the building is behind this facade. So this allows to use brick in a way that these changes in the facade happens in a smooth way, as there are not columns behind them. Inside, he uses brute raw concrete for the main structure, also reduces from the mass through these huge circle openings, and then he is using wood for smaller scale objects in the space where people are interacting with, so furniture. So introducing some softer and warmer materials for where people interact with. Also, these giant openings in brute concrete in elevation stand in contrast to the warmth nature of the light coming in, somehow showing off the architectural materiality in making contrasts by using brute material and natural elements like light shining on the structure. We can see the use of different materials and how they interact with natural elements like light in different examples in architecture, how they express transition between materials and colors. These tectonic expressions are real means of designing spaces to enhance emotions and help to do storytelling in spaces. We can play with materials, masses, structures, and their effects to make patterns in a space, adding interesting details, or we can convey meaning and feeling. Usually arcades, you can play with their form and the way to have light inside to provide a rhythmic pattern to convey a sense of movement in a space. In video games, usually using light is to signal where the player needs to go next, and contrasting it with the materials and textures that you can use in the environment can be interesting in detailing virtual spaces. This is a visual comparison between the Church of Light and a game scene, showing the relations between the use of light and dark, how form and materials are contributing to this effect. So there are some takeaways. I hope that it was giving something to you. So I want to just highlight these points. Architecture can inform virtual environments and support a video game's story arc. By incorporating thoughtful architectural design into game backgrounds, developers can subtly convey meaning and intrinsically communicate the vibe of an area or scene to the player. A player may not understand all the architectural subtleties, but they can still feel their effect. It draws them in and allows the designer to guide the player's emotional responses to the area they're in. The architecture within a game emerges from its virtual world, designed as if by the inhabitants themselves. Finding the right architectural language to tell their stories elevates a video game from pretty good to something impactful, a memorable game worthy of awards. Using architectural characteristics such as form, dimensions, proportions, materials, textures, light, and colors help create a specific visual language that enhances the game narrative. Designers draw inspiration first and foremost from their surrounding with a greater knowledge of real-world projects. You can expand on these sources of inspiration. Studying architectural works provide especially valuable insights into how architects create meaningful environments, which can help you tell more engaging interactive stories for your games through the use of architecture. Thank you. So if there is any question, we have 5 minutes. Yeah. I think you should use the microphone for. Yeah, it is here.
Hello.
Hi, thanks for the really interesting talk. I just had a question about, I guess if you're starting off with a blank slate for your world, what are the sort of the rough orders that you would think about in terms of designing architecture or thinking about architecture for the world?
For a fantastical world that in games, like.
Yeah, I guess like if you were making like a cyberpunk world or like a fantasy world, what would be sort of the first thing you'd think about? Would it be the tectonics or?
So to be honest, I'm learning a lot going through different sessions in GCAP, and I suppose narrative of your game will help you a lot. So if you're talking about cyberpunk, like for example, light design in cyberpunk is very different from Gothic architecture if you look at real world examples. And starting from what you are narrating in the game, what you want to show. Especially yesterday, it was the session about tone that I attended, which was about value, and they were seeing what it is relevant to the narrative, what you want to highlight in a scene. So I think it will help a lot what you want to highlight, and then using architecture in the background, like how to accentuate that, will help a lot.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? Cool.
You said that you haven't really played that many games, or like you're learning.
I started 3 years ago by starting my PhD. Yeah.
Cool. I was just wondering, do you have a favorite example of a game that uses architecture really well to emphasize its story? Or just a favorite example?
For my research, I studied Control a lot. It is designed by an architect, so he uses these motifs and architectural language. Like he was telling me about with light, he made 30 different concretes in the world, and it is a world that is brutalist, just concrete, and he had to make changes and difference. So the player doesn't. It is not a boring space for the player. So making different concrete in the world was one of the aspects, like making different colors and giving them different texture. And also, he was telling me it was really hard for him to tell designers, wait until the light design is done, like light is baked on the wall, so it will give the details through that. So yeah, they are like different aspects, like using light is one, and like textures, different things to make that. But yeah, Control is one of my case studies, and also like I had a look at other games, like for example, Rain World. For example, in Rain World, it is 2D, and level design helps a lot. Like the game is full of AI creatures that I suppose playing that is really hard. I don't know if you have played it or no, but you are doomed to fail because they are AI and they just get you and you die. But the level designer was saying that they used walls in different ways to stop the sight, like control the AI creatures where to go, not to see you. So it was also challenging for them to make the level. So this was somehow the architecture that they were using, also with the light and the textures that they used in the levels.
Any other? Oh, yep.
Bit of a different one. How did you arrive at this as the subject of your PhD?
I was really lucky, actually. So I was looking at narrative in architecture, which is really different, and it is now not that interesting topic, I suppose, for many architects to look at, because there are many things going around it, and it is different from storytelling in storytelling media, like cinema and video games. But yeah, so someone suggested that to me. I was not a gamer, and I looked at some games. The first one I had a look and started playing was The Last of Us, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. So yeah. And it was a niche. Like for your PhD, you look to find something niche to start with.
Cool. Is that all? Yep.
Thank you. Just curious if your research has like crossed over into user-generated architecture, things like MMO house building, metaverse stuff, user-generated content. Something that like crossed through my mind as you were talking about that was like Alejandro's Aravena public housing projects, where players or people in real life can like it gives them the tools to create spaces in which, you know, they build meaningful narratives and yeah, if you've sort of had any thoughts about
Actually,
how that
not
applies to
yet.
games.
No, not yet, but that's really an interesting suggestion. So my research is looking at topics. What I presented is so different from what I'm researching. So my topic is atmospheres in representations of video game spaces. So the first article I wrote was about sound design, how it works in video game environments, and how it is related to architecture, like very abstract, and I had like very difficult time working on that. But yeah, for now I'm working on representational, like atmospheric characteristics in games. But yeah, that's a really good suggestion. Thank you.
Well, that's time. Everyone give a round of applause to Dorsa.